Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon to those that are listening virtually. We are just welcoming the last group that is going to join us today. My name is Oscar Castañeda, and I am the Vice President for the Americas Program in Jefe International, and it's a pleasure for me to be here today. This panel title is Investing in Our Planet, Partnering for Adaptation and Resilience to Climate Change. And the panel focuses on the most important issue that we are going to tackle in our lifetime, climate change. Climate change is already threatening the life and the security and especially food and farming systems all around the world. In the last weeks, India and Pakistan have been affected by temperatures rising over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. With that temperature, then the crops died and the security of those families are gone. Livestock cannot survive, and we don't have a future under those conditions. And this is not a seldom event. 2 years ago, I'm from Central America, we suffer back-to-back the effect of two Category 4 hurricanes, Eta and Iota. They set back the future of Central America at least 2-3 decades. And the families that are affected the most are those that put food in our table. So I would like to have the time to go over those different things and be able to communicate something that is so terrifying, that is really affecting our lives. But then at the same time, I really would like to convey that we are hopeful. We are hopeful because the partnership that we had in different organizations, Jefe International has a very strong partnership to smallholder farmers. And those smallholder farmers are the ones that can put food on the table, and by managing the natural resources, they can help to cool the planet. We don't do that alone. We do that in partnerships with co-ops, with governments locally and nationally, but also with the private sector to invest in those areas that are most needed, in places where those smallholder farmers can add more value. So if we expand that partnership and are able to bring different networks together, we can hope for the future, not only for us, but for the next generations. Having said that, I'm so proud and glad to be able to introduce the panel and hand it over to Sally Josell. She is a fellow and the director of environmental security at the Stimson Center. So thank you very much, and let's pay attention to the panel. Sally, over to you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. And yeah, I would have to say that hopeful is the word, probably by folks in this room. I mean, why else would we all be doing this work, and why would we be here? So thank you for that kind introduction. I also want to thank Catherine Raffleson and the Society for International Development US for organizing this amazing conference, and I want to welcome all of you to this great session. And it was really nice and to hear Director Powers, her inspirational talk about the work at USAID and across the Biden administration, really to support communities and people around the world. And I think, as she said, those communities who are facing climate shocks. And so, as you just heard, my name is Sally Josell, and I'm with the Stimson Center and run their environmental security program. We're a think tank, nonpartisan think tank here in Washington, D.C. And our environmental program really examines the linkages, how the linkages between environmental and degradation in natural resources threats can, so undermine economic, food, and ecological security in communities. So we develop solutions, and then we work with governments and communities to really implement. We like to call our program Research to Action. And around the world, obviously, there is no threat more serious to the planet than climate change and the climate emergency. And that's why I'm really looking forward to hearing from this very impressive panel of heavy hitters who focus on climate solutions and facilitate the work to support people threatened by the climate crisis every day all across the world. And our panel includes Gillian Caldwell, who is the Chief Climate Officer and Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, Stefan Hallegate, who is the Senior Climate Change Advisor to the World Bank, and Jonathan Richard, the Deputy Vice President of Infrastructure, Environment, and Private Sector Division within the Millennium Challenge Corporation. But before we begin the panel, I'd like to set the stage a bit, if you don't mind. And so, as I just said, at the Stimson Center, much of our climate work really focuses on the threat to coastal and freshwater resources and the people and communities who really depend on them. And whether it's landlocked or coastal communities, these are places, as you can see from this infographic, that are facing immense cascading climate risks. And, whether, for example, if I could, talking about coastal cities and island states, they are really, as we have learned, at the forefront of climate change. This is particularly true across the global south, where they are often the least responsible for climate change, but the most vulnerable to its impacts. And so, for example, just to talk about coastal communities, we all know they rely heavily on their blue economies. The UN recently came out with a report that said the global blue economy value is worth like $2.5 trillion annually. So whether it's tourism or fisheries or energy, shipping, and the health and safety of the citizens who live in these communities, all of them really depend on healthy and diverse ecosystems, including coral reefs, seagrasses, and mangroves. But many of you may have seen the report that came out last week by the World Meteorological Organization that is telling us we're going in the wrong direction. Sea levels are continuing to rise. Ocean temperatures are continuing to rise. The ocean is becoming more acidic. And then the storms are just increasing in their severity. And all of this is really threatening the ecosystems which people and communities rely on. And so it's these sorts of threats also, they don't stop at the shoreline. Severe storms are continuing to increase flooding in the mountains, which comes down into the communities. And along rivers, well, we've all been reading about the extended droughts and wildfires that just continue to set global records. So then when you add in the social and economic problems that any city or community face, like overcrowding, unplanned development, aging water and wastewater infrastructure, pollution, unemployment, inequity, when you add these threats to the when you add this to the climate threats, what you really end up with is the environment, the economy, food, and human security all escalate. And I know many of us would say that that is difficult and finding fixes feels really distant and out of reach, but I am hopeful, and to build resilience and address these diverse and cascading threats, cities and communities have an opportunity to really take a holistic and integrated approach to these risks. But it's not easy. I mean, decision makers, we know, often lack the type of really comprehensive information and local data necessarily to understand the granular effects. But, to fill this information gap, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of our work at the Stimson Center, where we're literally looking holistically across the land and seascape to really help come up with recommendations and prioritize actions. And so as you can see on the Corby wheel, what we're doing is we focus on 10 categories of risk, and then we integrate that with economic, social, and environmental data across 100 risk indicators. And for those of you, that is a lot of data and information. And we combine this data with surveys from and meetings with experts and community leaders and specialists to really fill the data gaps that exist and provide more complete pictures for these communities of their state of climate risk. And the Corby process is helping communities break down those silos. I mean, it's been so interesting. By bringing together diverse public and private sector experts, what we found is we often hear in our workshops, participants have never met each other. It's the first time they've worked together across sectors, despite perhaps being part of the same government or in the same community. And when decision makers view climate through this really multidimensional lens, priorities do arise and they become more clear. And this is important in our resource-scarce environment. Almost every Corby risk assessment we have undertaken, whether in East Africa, the Pacific, or in the Caribbean, has really brought into focus the importance of addressing climate risk in this cross-cutting manner, tackling issues like informal housing and aging infrastructure alongside safeguarding ecosystems, adding green infrastructure, and increasing nature-based solutions. So this is the kind of multi-pronged approach that can set communities on the path to build climate resilience and provide funders the confidence that their resources are being spent wisely and where it matters most. So with that sort of framing and beginning, let's get to our panel of experts and hear how we can all do this. And I'm looking forward to really hearing the new approaches their organizations are taking on climate adaptation and offer us ideas on what we need to do to mobilize resources necessary to build climate resilience. And we're going to start off with Gillian. So Gillian, you know, there was the recent IPCC report has estimated that climate change is going to drive up, can drive up to 132 million people into extreme poverty in just the next decade. So with this in mind, I was hoping you could sort of tell us about the new USAID climate strategy, and if you could pass this down, the new USAID climate strategy, and how it will help build climate adaptation and resilience moving forward.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sally, and to SID for having me here today. So we have just launched a strategy that will take us through 2030 with some extremely ambitious goals across multiple terrains, including adaptation and resilience. But first, for those of you who are less familiar with USAID, if anyone in the room, we have a presence in 100 countries globally, missions in 80. Our fiscal 21 budget was $26.7 billion, and we have 10,000 staff. So this is a substantial footprint, and what is most exciting about our strategy is that President Biden has announced that all federal agencies are climate agencies, and we're taking that quite seriously. So the goals that I'm about to show you for achievement by 2030 are goals towards which every mission bureau and operating unit is being asked to contribute, whether you're working on education or health or agriculture, because of course the impacts of climate change are far-reaching, and you know, it's threatening to undo the progress that we've made, and will certainly imperil any future progress we hope to, unless we contour our programming in ways that are climate smart and climate positive. So here you see the overarching goals for achievement by 2030. We want to reduce carbon emissions by 6 billion metric tons. So that's the equivalent of approximately all U.S. emissions in an entire year. The vast majority of that carbon mitigation will be through nature-based solutions, especially keeping forests standing. As you're all aware, deforestation is a major driver of the climate crisis. We want to protect and preserve 100 million hectares of land. We are the lead agency on the President's initiative announced at the COP in Glasgow on adaptation and resilience, cooperating closely with other federal agencies. And the goal under that is to increase the adaptation and resilience of at least 500 million people worldwide, with a heavy emphasis there on climate information services. and I can talk more about that. Importantly, we have a goal to catalyze $150 billion in climate finance. We don't have $150 billion to give away. And we recognize that with the gaps being projected in climate finance for mitigation and adaptation, a gap of 590% per the IPCC by 2030, we're looking at $3 to $5 trillion a year required to meet the financial demand of the climate crisis. We are not going to get there through public or multilateral funds alone. We need the private sector. So we're really trying to step up our engagement in blended finance, pipeline development, and work surrounding the enabling environment. Really importantly, we need to get beyond talk to action. There are protests surrounding the COP every year for good reason, because we just had our 26th COP and yet emissions keep rising. What good are the promises if we're not having any effects? Even if we were to stop carbon emissions entirely today, the feedback loops are such that they would continue to cause havoc for 3 decades to come. So we are in a very serious situation, and we absolutely need to see every country deliver on its NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So all of our missions in 80 countries globally are being asked to look at what they can do through technical and financial support to enable those governments to deliver on their NDCs, and in some cases to continue to increase the ambition of those NDCs. And finally, because equity is a really central component of this strategy, we are looking to really enable systems-changing interventions in 40 countries globally to increase the participation and engagement of marginalized groups such as Indigenous people and local communities, women, youth, and other marginalized groups. In the interest of time, I won't go through this strategic framework in detail. You can see it at usaid.gov/climate/strategy. But you can see we have a series of direct actions which are intended to, focus in the near term on mitigation, adaptation, finance, and, special goals regarding the engagement of Indigenous people and other crucial voices such as women and youth. The focus on Indigenous peoples, of course, is critically necessary because they steward the vast majority of carbon critical landscape in the world, and they face all sorts of discrimination and in some cases assassination for defending their land and their territories. Under systems change, of course, we need the long-term enabling environment, the right market forces, the right laws and policies, the right kind of collaboration across sectors, and a strong anti-corruption agenda to enable that these countries are investment ready from a private sector perspective as well as the public sector. And you'll see the embedded principles, heavy focus on locally led development. Not enough USAID money is going direct to nationally based groups or more locally based groups. And, several prior USAID administrations have made it a priority to change that. Once again, this is a top priority. As are the other dimensions you're seeing here. Finally, do our part. That's really about our own emissions, taking stock through greenhouse gas inventories, making commitments to reducing emissions, and increasing the resilience of our own infrastructure and workforce globally. So let me pause it there.
Wow, great. Thank you, Gillian, for all that you're doing. And I really move beyond talk and get to action. I think we're all about that, and we all really want that. And it's going to take everyone in this room and governments around the world to really get there. And it's also going to take big financial institutions like the World Bank. The World Bank, as we know, has been tackling climate change for many years, but they too, like aid, recently developed a new climate action plan. And I was hoping, Stefan, that you could sort of give us some of the highlights of the plan on how that's going to change the way the bank addresses climate in its programming.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation. As you said, we just had, now it has been a few months, a new climate change action plan going to 2025. So we're not looking as far ahead as USAID, but for the next 5 years. And so a few key takeaways from this plan. I mean, first, I think it's really important to remind that we haven't changed our mandate, which is still poverty reduction and development. And we're doing climate not because we decided that we want to do climate. We're doing climate because we feel that tackling climate change is needed to achieve our mandate of reducing poverty and ensuring development. So I think it's really important that to us, climate is just needed for this development agenda, not a new separate objective. We have three main pillars in this plan. One is the mainstreaming agenda, because we feel that this is really where things need to start. One big part of that is a new core diagnostic that we'll do in all of the countries we're acting in. So we used to have core diagnostics on economic growth, on poverty, and on public finance. And now we'll have a fourth one on climate. So it's a big deal within the institution to just bring this agenda at the same level as looking at economic growth or the public finance question. Then we have a second pillar, which is focused on the sectors. There's a lot of things you have to do in transport and water and urbanization and so on. So the sectoral lens is also really, really important. And the last pillar is about finance. And of course, you know how hard it can be to mobilize finance for adaptation, especially. So in that domain, we have our own balance sheets that we will use more to do climate change interventions. So we aim at having 35% of our annual commitments on climate change. And the important change is this idea of having a balance between what we are doing on adaptation and resilience and what we're doing on emission reduction. So it's 50-50 distribution. As Gillian was saying, 35% of the World Bank commitment is nice, but it's really a drop in the ocean. So for financing, a lot of the work is working on financial systems, greening financial systems so that all investments are greener, and the mobilization of private capital, of course, being a big part of that. I just wanted to take one step back on the topic of today and this focus on adaptation, because one thing that we find repeatedly is that adaptation is very much a development challenge, and if you don't have a decent development path, if you keep part of your population in extreme poverty, if your governance is not working, if you don't have the right basic institutions, I mean, you can do all of the adaptation you want, the population will remain vulnerable. So there is, and it can be understood, there is this focus on targeted action with measurable results on adaptation, but really it shouldn't be at the expense of the broader development challenge, building institutions, having a system that works, because all actors in your economy will want to adapt. Nobody likes to be flooded or losing crops. So the question is, how do we help them do that? And having a functioning economic and public system is really critical for that. So sometimes it's less easy to explain and to report on our interventions when we build a social protection system. It's not adaptation, right? But if you don't have it, you won't go very far in your adaptation process. So I think we have this challenge of having a big push on adaptation, but making sure we're not trying to go toward what can be seen, but also doing the foundation that is required. One thing that we did recently is to look at urbanization trends. At this point, we're doing a lot of adaptation to reduce flood risks in cities. And at the same time, we develop our cities in flood zones much more than in safe areas. So I think this is this race, right? We won't solve this problem if we try to reduce risk with one pot of money and all of the other systems are increasing risk in parallel. We'll lose this race. So we really want to go beyond adaptation as a separate target. But basically the idea is we should screen all policies, all investments, public, private, international, domestic, so that future risks are taken into account in those decisions. And we're developing tools, and then we're helping countries implement those tools. And scaling up is very difficult. We have very nice examples for everything we do. Could show you tons of very nice examples. The question is, how do we reach 7-8 billion people? So it's all in the scale up that the challenge lies at the moment. And finally, last point, adaptation resilience, it's super easy to make the link with development, right? I mean, disasters, crop losses and so on, it's a barrier to development and poverty reduction. I think at this point in time, we can make the same point on emission reductions. We're working a lot on the emission reductions part of the development story. And so we're working on one of those diagnostic in the Sahel, for instance. renewable energy today, small-scale solar, mini-grids, it's all new technologies that fix a lot of the issues we've had for decades in the Sahel. So I think that the development angle and this positive vision that we can use climate policies to accelerate development, it's obvious on adaptation and resilience. It's more and more true on emission reductions. And this is really something that we need to take into account because we're not capturing all of the opportunities that we have. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Stefan. Music to my ears, scaling up, integration, understanding that this is a cascading risk, all really good. And so with that, I'm gonna, if we could, do you have the clicker? If we could bring the changer down. So thank you. So John, the question I have for you, is obviously we're hearing the climate crisis has taken hold. It's here. We need it to eradicate poverty and so many other issues. The Millennium Challenge Corporation has really been known for its work on alleviating poverty and improving economies. But I gather the MCC has just released its first climate strategy last year. And so I believe it has a number of commitments, very specific commitments on climate. So, I'm kind of hoping you can help all of us understand this sort of shift and provide us with some insights into what your strategy is focusing on and actions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sally, and thank you for the opportunity to join this panel today. I will be brief, and I think what I wanted to start with is actually just a really quick overview of who we are and what we do, because that will help explain when I shift to the climate strategy, why it looks like it does and why it contains some of the pieces. So to start off with, just to note, MCC is a U.S. Can you bring the mic? Can you guys hear me? Is that? I don't think it's on. Is it on? Yeah. Better? No? I can try. I'm right up against it. Is that better? All right. Thank you for checking. So we are an independent U.S. government agency, and we do have a singular mission, reducing poverty through sustainable economic growth. Now, there are a number of things that make us different in the broader development landscape, and I just want to touch on a few of those here. First, we don't work everywhere. We only work in selected countries. We work in low and low-middle income countries, and only those countries that are committed to good governance, economic freedom, and investing in its people. We have a whole department that scores countries against a set of third-party indicators, recommends to our board, and selects where we work. But the core point is we only work in a limited number of places in the good-performing countries. Second piece I want to touch on here is that we provide grants. This is not loans. They're large-scale grants, and these are for country-led solutions. So we don't implement. The country's in the driver's seat. They mobilize a team. They implement. We oversee, and we support. Now, we have two types of grants. The first is compacts that people tend to be most familiar with. These are large-scale grants. They tend to be on the order of $350 to $400 million. Some have been as much as $700 million. And these tend to include infrastructure, policy reforms, capacity building, a whole package of investments. The other type of grant we have are called threshold programs, and these are smaller scale. They tend to be on the order of $20 to $50 million, and they tend to focus on policy reforms, institutional strengthening, technical assistance, and thresholds are really targeting countries that are not yet eligible for a compact, but are on a good trajectory and are moving towards performing well as well. In addition, everything we do, we talk about data. Data drives where we work, it drives the sectors we work in, it drives the projects we support, it drives the scope and nature of those projects, and all through our analysis of impact and results on the ground with our monitoring and evaluation framework. Two other pieces I want to highlight in this data sense is a constraints analysis. So when we go in and we engage a country, we do an analysis of the binding constraints to economic growth. What's holding it back? Where do we want to target our investments? And as part of that, we look at the private sector and hurdles to private investment. We looked at gender and social inclusion. And again, we try to target our investments where we can unleash economic development. The other piece just to highlight here is everything we do, we look at an economic rate of return. We want to make sure that, again, we're doing that calculus on the costs and the benefits and spending our money where it's going to be most effective and impactful. Last thing to highlight here is that we do take an integrated approach, and I think you touched on that, Sally, in your intro. People think of infrastructure when they think of MCC, and we do that, but we also do the soft side, right? So it's the hard infrastructure plus the policy reforms, the enabling environment, the technical assistance, and the capacity building. What is it going to take to address the sector as a whole to get the impact and results that we want? Last piece just to note is that we have 5 years to do all this. There is a lead time. There's a prep time. Obviously, preparing any infrastructure takes a significant amount of effort and time. But once we start, we have 5 years to implement. And that really lights a fire under, I will say, all sides to really deliver and execute quickly. You'll see on the side the sectors we work in, transport, so roads, ports. We have agriculture, irrigated agriculture, water sanitation, again, the traditional package of sectors. And again, a lot of this is on our website as well for those interested. Now, let me turn to the specific question that you asked, Sally, because this really is critical for us. From our standpoint, and given our mission, we really view addressing climate change as central to our mission. We recognize that climate, poverty, and economic growth are inextricably linked, and that, frankly speaking, the countries where we work are on the front lines of climate change. They're feeling it, they're living it every day. They are the least responsible for it, yet they are the most impacted and the least able to afford to manage and adapt. So, for us, this isn't something new. This is something we want to do better. We want to raise our ambition. We've always screened our projects for climate impacts, but we want to do more. And so this is what led us last year to really step up our ambition, come out with our first climate strategy and a range of commitments on climate that, again, it's on the website, but let me just walk through and highlight a few pieces here. The first one is investing in climate-smart development and sustainable infrastructure. And here I think the core pieces I want to underscore is that we want to be systematic and deliberate about what we invest in. We want to look at a country's priorities related to climate. We want to look at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and support them. We want to ensure that any infrastructure we develop is resilient in the face of a changing climate. We want to help countries adapt, and we want to look for ways we can support projects that promote a low-carbon economic development pathway. Part of this also includes a commitment to having 50% of our program funds committed to climate-related investments over the next 5 years. In fact, we did a scrub of our past portfolio and realized we had done previously $1.7 billion in 2015 to 2020. We want to step that up. Another key piece to highlight is our analytical tools. And I touched on a moment ago our constraints analysis and our economic rates of return. As we look at our decision making, as we look at those early analyses that dictate what we invest in, what sectors, what types of projects, we need to factor climate in. We need to factor the costs, we need to factor the benefits. That certainly poses data challenges, and some of what you touched on earlier is how do you get that data? It poses challenges in terms of factoring in longer term benefits that perhaps once you apply a discount rate don't quite stack up in the same way. But we want to integrate climate more effectively into our tools, into our guidance, and frankly, into our investment criteria and decision making. Policy institutional reform, this is another key piece. I think we've heard some common themes here, and this is the challenge with going third, and maybe it's a good thing you see some overlap. This is critical in all of what we do as well. We have the big grant dollars that allows us to have a dialogue with the government, leverage key policy and institutional reforms. We want to do that for climate as well. We want to look at ways we can again promote the development path, promote better management of resources, look at things like building codes, sector infrastructure master plans. How can we bring climate into that part of the business? Gillian touched on this. We have a limited amount of money. We need to find ways to leverage, to partner with others, to bring in private capital, and really partner to expand our scope and expand our impact. So blended finance and partnerships has always been a core thrust of MCC. In fact, we've always looked to leverage this, but here too, we want to bring it in for climate. We want to look at new mechanisms. We want to ensure that the private investment that we catalyze is climate friendly, but also look at how we can get more private investment into that zone. Last piece, and I think Gillian touched on this as well, but we're looking at ourselves, right? We have our own operations, our own headquarter operations. We want to get a better handle on what our own carbon footprint is and look for ways we can improve it. That includes staff travel, that includes the building resilience and the energy efficiency, and we're looking for ways to step that up as well. So with that, let me stop there. I know that's a lot, but looking forward to the further discussion and questions. Thank you.
Well, again, John, that is also terrific. And, overlap is a good thing because, we're all facing the same sort of issues. And again, integration, ambition, are really seem to be the buzzwords of the day, and hopefully they're the buzz actions of the future. And so what I'd like to do is sort of, come up with ask some of our panelists questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But, no one entity can do this alone, obviously. We've heard that from all three of our panelists. And so, Gillian, a question I have, your new strategy is really ambitious, and you talked about the need for blended finance, partnerships and working with others. So could you just sort of give us a sense of, how is this strategy going to work with other stakeholders and partners, and how are you going to achieve that kind of financing that you need and achieve this blended finance?
So I can give you a couple of examples of what we mean when we talk about blended finance in the adaptation space. And I think it's important because, it's very inchoate where the private sector is involved to understand like what a adaptation related investment looks like. I think the data shows that only 3% of private investments in climate-related terrain go to adaptation and resilience. That's probably a slight underestimate because, where there are adaptation co-benefits, it's much easier to quantify the mitigation benefits. And of course, with the number of net zero commitments out there, people are going to want to lean into those mitigation-related benefits. But still, there's far too little, and that has to do with, the tenor or the length of the time it may take to deliver yield in adaptation-related investments. It may also have to do with the scope of the yield as compared to renewable energy, which is, very attractive for private investors in many parts of the world now. So we have a vehicle called a SELI, and the focus there is really on getting smallholder farmers the support they need to adapt to climate-smart agricultural practice. So ag is one of the first places people's mind go when they think about blended finance and investment opportunities. A second, we are active in the carbon markets. I've actually asked the team to really take a careful and strategic look at what we can do there because, of course, mitigation's a dominant component there. But there are also, especially with nature-based solutions, many adaptation and resilience-related co-benefits. We have a project with Rangeland Trust Africa in Kenya that's focused on nature-based solutions in a voluntary carbon market, which is another opportunity for investment. A third is water and sanitation. Obviously, we're going to see, there already have been huge stressors, with the kind of temperatures you're talking about and highly variable rainfall and drought in many areas. So we have a goal by 2030 to mobilize $1 billion specifically in climate resilient water and sanitation. Disaster risk financing, I think that may also have been mentioned. There we're looking at, new insurance instruments as well as other financial capability, so that when people are facing flooding or megastorms or drought, they're able to sort of put things back together more swiftly than they would otherwise. When we think about the 150 billion target, and that's in mitigation and adaptation with a heavy emphasis on trying to increase that adaptation-related funding. The vast majority will come through the work we do in enabling environments because we would count towards that 150 billion the money that's catalyzed when we work with governments as we have to set up a renewable energy auction. And there's a lot of private investment that comes to the table, in a fair and transparent auction that enables governments to buy forward renewable energy at competitive prices. So, the cheapest way to get there is to create the enabling environment for the private sector to do its work. So that's really important. Another component is the pipeline development itself. It's interesting, depending on who you talk to in the finance space, some people will say, well, we have lots of money, we just don't have the projects. And other people will say, we have lots of projects, we just don't have the money. So it kind of depends on where you sit in the terrain and the nature of the investments you're interested in making. But there is a need for pipeline development. For sure. We're also, really looking at new instruments in blended finance. things like first loss and concessionary capital and, junior equity, and, other kinds of capabilities, experimenting with those and really encouraging other bilateral donors and hopefully multilaterals as well to partner with us to bring these deals to fruition, and really thinking carefully about the need to avoid displacing private capital. I mean, the easiest thing to do with a goal that ambitious is to go for the low-hanging fruit. But what we shouldn't be doing with precious public capital is displacing private capital that would make its way there anyway. And going back to my point about, whether it's the pipeline or the money that's the problem, that those variable answers reflect the need for more connective tissue, and I think USAID has a lot of convening power, so we're going to be trying to bring multi-sector stakeholders together around opportunities for investment on adaptation and resilience. Thanks.
Great. Well, yes, USAID certainly does, with your breadth, as you outlined, at the outset, have the connective tissue all around the world, and that's terrific. And so, I'm going to, Stefan, I'm going to sort of ask a similar question to you. You talked about how the bank has been mainstreaming climate risk into its existing programs, and you're undertaking targeted climate adaptation measures. But you also highlighted even, everyone thinks the bank has an endless amount of funds to do this kind of work, but you highlighted that you don't. And so same, kind of question, how do you bring in your partners and stakeholders and other financial partners to really get this work done where you're seeing the need?
So maybe I'll start by talking about what's going on inside, because one thing that I noticed is none of us talked about skilling up inside. And to us, I mean, I'm in the climate change group of the World Bank, but bringing the rest of the World Bank along is part of the story, because they are the ones talking with governments and with partners on the ground. And so when I talked about those diagnostics, I know what you thought, right? One more report, who cares about that? I know you thought that. But after like a year working on that, what we have achieved is all of our teams in almost all of our countries have been working really hard on climate change. And now when we have a meeting on the topic, the level of the conversations is just not a comparison with what we had a year ago. We have teams who know about the issue, they have thought about it, they have engaged with external and internal partners and so on. And so the value of this upskilling is really, really important, especially to engage with partners. We had a tendency to engage as climate change group of the World Bank. It's nice, but it's not what's needed. What we need is to have our country offices engaging with local partners and creating this network on the ground. And that we could not do from HQ here. We really needed to just upskill all of our teams. So we have this work where we force our teams to think about this. We have training programs, and I think this is something that's really, really, really important. On the private sector, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the low-hanging fruits, because one of the big risks is that this push to mobilize private finance would push us to do what's easy. Because, I mean, the easy stuff, you can bring private sector much more easily than on the hard stuff. So I think we always needs to look at the mobilization on the one hand, but also the ambition on the other hand. And it works only if we combine the two. But we're very, very careful not to use especially our own balance sheet on things that could be done by other actors domestically. Finally, and I wanted also to mention that in reaction to John's big focus on tools, because I think this is really, really important. You can make all of the points you want if then in the Ministry of Finance, the tools that they use to think about their budgets doesn't include any of what we're talking about here, it will never pass the Ministry of Finance screening. So if people don't have tools fit for purpose, we're in big trouble. So we have a lot of capacity building to try to build that up. But I just wanted to mention one big concern, which is poor people are much more affected than the rest of the populations, even within countries. And a lot of the tools we have, looking at aggregate numbers, tends to favor action toward the richest part of the population. So we had this program in the Philippines thinking about the priorities for disaster risk reduction. And of course, normal tools, you have like Manila flashing in big red because that's where the assets are, that's where the economic value is. If you're doing the same analysis thinking in terms of risk for poverty reduction, you have very different maps in front of you. So this is super technical, not very exciting, very difficult to report on that and to put a dollar amount on the benefits of changing the model that somebody is running in a dark corridor of the Ministry of Finance. But if we don't do that, we cannot get the project through the door. So I think there are a lot of things which are not very visible, very difficult to assess, but play a critical role. And in the partnership, this is really what we're trying to do, is to make sure we target all of those areas, especially with local experts and local research centers and universities. Thank you.
Yeah, Stefan, that you make such a good point. I know, like with our own work on Corvi, we always have local partners, and we always try to get the finance ministry to be engaged right up front. It's so critical. And I don't think anyone in this room, you know, I think everyone would sort of geek out on what you just said, how important that is. I think everyone would agree with that, so don't worry about that. And, you know, just building on, again, John, some of the work that MCC is doing, I mean, you know, you're talking about committing like 50% of your funding to climate-related investments. I mean, that's a big shift. And so how does this really align with the model you've had over the years of country ownership? And you talked about data-driven decision-making, but, I mean, 50% is a big commitment.
It is, and let me just start by saying, you know, our model is not changing, and this climate commitment is very much, as we view it, consistent with our model. And a lot of that comes back to that core point I made about what our mission is and why addressing climate and poverty and economic development are all inextricably linked. For us, that means we've got to take that data-driven decision-making. You know, we need to shape our projects based on that and move in that direction. So this is not a change to our model, but I think one other piece I think I'd like to underscore here, it actually comes back to some of what Stefan was touching on, is, you know, as we look at how we do what we do and how we certainly, you know, upskilling is really critical, because this is requiring a little bit of a culture shift and a little bit of an awareness raising and frankly a behavior change about how we work internally and how we apply that model. How do we use those tools, and how is it more than just a climate unit, but how is it on the minds of those working in agriculture or integrated into those working in blended finance? And you know, we're pushing on that. That takes time, but I do think that is critical in terms of moving the needle, and frankly, you know, not to use a loaded term, but mainstreaming climate into our decision making, into our guidance and tools, versus viewing it as something that's a separate add-on. We're going to go do climate projects, is I think something we were very mindful of as we set out with this strategy, and certainly our approach to implementing that strategy.
Yeah, mainstreaming climate into existing work is, you know, that is going to be that integrated, you know, holistic approach. So I'm going to ask the panel one more question, if I could, and then open it up to the audience. This is a general question, really. You know, many of us were in Glasgow at COP26, and countries from the global south really made their voices heard that not enough resources were going to help them build resilience, and that there needed to be more of a leveling between mitigation and adaptation funding. So as we head into COP27 in Egypt, what do you think your programs can offer? What do you see as how we can sort of help balance this out a bit more? Anyone?
Anyone? So,
Go ahead.
okay, maybe one point on that, because so without saying that enough is flowing toward adaptation, I think we still have to keep in mind that the definition of adaptation is a really difficult thing, right? So if I look at our own interventions in water and sanitation, it's not 100% counted as adaptation. But there's no doubt every time we're doing water and sanitation, it increases resilience of the populations. So I think the comparison with mitigation, to me, is a little bit difficult to make. So we should be a bit careful about that. Every time somebody builds a house with the right characteristics, it's adaptation, and this spending is it's not counted by anyone. So I think the situation is not as bad as those numbers sometimes suggest. I think what is the big challenge is to finance very targeted adaptation interventions when most of the benefits are public goods, better health, reduced risks for community. It's very difficult in part because adaptation success is avoided crisis. Avoided crisis nobody cares about. No policymakers have even been rewarded for avoiding a crisis. I think we have this problem that it's not a very attractive thing for policymakers. And if you don't have the right policies, there is no way you'll have the right financing because you need to transform those benefits, these avoided costs, into a financial flow. And that's really tricky to do. So we're looking at different ways. The land value capture is one option, especially in cities. You can do things this way. But more generally, I think there is this body of work that will be largely funded by public money. And I think that the goal of mobilizing private capital, in a way, is to make sure we have enough public resources to do those things that nobody else will do. And I'm particularly talking about people in extreme poverty that will not be able to protect themselves without external support.
Yeah, great. Gillian?
Yeah, and happy to add. Go ahead.
Either one.
Right. So, obviously in the lead up to COP, I'm standing by for the tasker from the NSC. So we're already getting on it, which is to really clarify what progress we've made since Glasgow. My emphasis at the interagency level in conversations is, let's not make new commitments. Let's demonstrate progress towards the many ambitious commitments we already made, some of which are really still being fleshed out and better understood at an interagency level. So that's my bias. I know there's some people with me, others that, like the flashy announcements. So we'll see how this all goes. But I know the aid is going to be very focused on concretizing the progress we've made. I'm not in a position to give you, the numbers and the statistics at this stage, not least of which because we're not in November. We still have quite a bit of time to go, albeit not much in the scheme of things. But I think it is going to be really important to make it more visible and tangible, the progress that people are making, and also to avoid what feels like an attribution exercise. When you talk about climate-related investments, how do we define climate-related investments? The devil is so much in these details. The U.S. government was reluctant in the context of COP to make a commitment to that 50-50 split. I think for many of the reasons you just articulated, I couldn't agree more. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. government, especially USAID, isn't really dedicated to rebalancing the portfolio. So, we're really pushing hard to do as much as we can on the adaptation front.
That's great, John.
And just to add briefly, this is something we are also very aware of, would also very much echo the importance of actually implementing and following through on the commitments made. Nevertheless, adaptation is something that tends to get a little bit less airtime. People don't talk about as much. We do want to make sure all of the infrastructure we support is obviously climate resilient, but there are other opportunities that we want to look to scale up. We're looking at coastal zone restoration in Mozambique, mangrove restoration in seagrass, and partnering with others. We see opportunities to bring in the private sector here as well. It's a little bit more difficult, frankly, in the adaptation space than, when you think about renewable energy. That's an easy one. That's a quick win for the private sector because there's money to be made. But there are areas in agriculture where you can bring in the private sector, you can bring in new technologies, and this is something we will also want to be pushing the envelope on and being better about tracking and talking about.
Great. Well, this is all really terrific. I agree, 50-50 split. Trying to put numbers on that is just too hard, but we do need to balance more, and I think all of you just gave a great response on how we can get there. So I'd like to really open it up, and again, I apologize. I can't, to folks around the corner who can't see me, but hopefully you can hear me. If people could please line up, tell us who you are, and then fire away.
Thanks very much. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza at PACT, and I'm originally from a small developing island, and I'd like to ask a little bit of your perspective from a rights perspective. So we were looking at equity, inclusion, financial mobilization. As you look at the rights agenda from a climate change perspective, are you seeing this coming in primarily through a just transition? How are you looking at questions around loss and damage? So if you could talk about those sets of issues, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, rights and equity and inclusion. Do any of the three of you?
I'm just wondering, given time, if it wouldn't make sense to get a group of questions that we could, I mean, it's up to you, but do we have 5 minutes for questions? I'm seeing a long line.
Yeah, we do have a long line. I'm looking to, I don't know if our organizer is here. Is it a hard stop, or could we go 5 minutes over? We're fine. Let's just answer a question, and then because I think we'll try to answer them quickly.
Yeah, so loss and damage is another place, as everybody will be aware, where the United States has been reluctant to make commitments. The State Department does lead on the negotiations on that front. I think that's because we're already struggling to step up to quadruple our investment to $11.4 billion by 2024 on climate finance, and the global community committed to $100 billion at Paris, and we still haven't gotten there in any of the years since. So we're just way off. But I think there's some really important work being done around the right to a clean and healthy environment. In fact, some really important litigation being pursued, especially as regards the, using something similar to the tobacco litigation, where the fossil fuel companies knew and invested in disinformation and have caused significant consequences. I was on the board of an organization that is suing some of the major fossil fuel companies in Colorado right now, and has survived several motions to dismiss along these lines. And you're seeing more and more. There's Kids for Climate pursuing the right of children to a healthy future. And there's new bills emerging in various countries around the world akin to Future Generations Acts, which will require policymakers to consider future generations in passing any legislation. So I think it's an important terrain to watch.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, overnight, I have to say, I got an email from Tuvalu and Vanuatu highlighting some of these same issues. Yes, why don't we go on to next over here, please.
Hi, I'm Susanna Wupong-Calvert with the Foundation for Family and Community Healing, and also the Unitarian Universalist Ministry for Earth. And I want to commend everybody here for their work finding solutions for a VUCA world using a systems and integrated approach. And I'm also wondering if part of that systems approach is something that I hadn't heard mentioned, and I rarely hear mentioned, is this social, emotional, and cultural aspects of what got us here in the first place. And to me, it's like the golden goose is not laying those eggs very well. And what do we need to do to keep her laying those eggs, and how do we survive that? And so not that we ignore those questions or approaches, but also to say, well, shouldn't this goose be thriving? And what if she was not on life support anymore and was vibrant and healthy? And how much goose and down could she then make for all of us? And I know that that's the goal on some level, but that's not really what we talk about. And because that would also require a different perspective and approach. And to me, it starts with remembering how much we love that goose and how important that goose is to us. So I'm just wondering if, in addition to the systems view,
Okay,
if that's social, emotional, and cultural.
So social, emotional, and cultural issues. I don't know, Stefan or John, if you would like to try that, take that on.
Well, I've worked quite a lot on natural disaster management, and those aspects are absolutely critical for anybody working on disaster risk management, right? From having people react to the warnings that we give, that the way you communicate the warning needs to be connected to how people make their own decisions, who is receiving the information, how do you manage then the recovery with people who have very often physical and mental health issues, the question of resettlements when there are like attachments to place, And of course, I mean, the question of sea level rise and small islands will put this problem to an extreme. So all of these aspects, I think, are included in some of our work already. We can always do better. And I think maybe one hope is that bringing the environment and this challenge related to climate change will help us bring that also more generally in development. So we can also think about this opportunity to make sure this is included in everything we do.
Great, thank you. Yes, please.
I'm Udunopa Abalu with International Development Group, or IDG. Thank you all for your shared insights so far. I appreciate our conversation on adaptation and resilience for climate change, which I think should not be devoid of addressing the world's energy dilemma. On the one hand, we are trying to drastically reduce our carbon footprint, especially in higher income countries. And on the other hand, we have lower income countries that still depend heavily on fossil fuels. So I'm interested in hearing each agency's perspectives and your approach to increasing energy investments to combat climate change, especially in lower income countries where we're still trying to catapult clean energy innovations and other technologies. Thank you.
Great question. John, maybe you can talk about some of the clean energy investments that your team is doing.
Yeah, happy to talk about that, and thank you for the question. That is a good point. You know, this is something that's front and center in all of our energy investments, and I will say, you know, when I talk about our country ownership and I talk about the dialogue we have with countries, this is also what they're asking for. I mean, they're saying, yes, you know, we need to develop, we need power, but they're also very aware of climate change, and so we see a big push on renewables. Solar is obviously a big one, certainly in West Africa. We're seeing, you know, utility scale solar. There's a big role for the private sector, but equally, we're increasingly, now that battery prices have come down, battery storage is more viable. Battery storage is also something that's on the docket. We've got a big program in Kosovo that supporting, you know, $200 million towards battery storage and catalyzing renewables to come online. You know, all of this is part of a broader package, and trying to, you know, frankly, move everything in the right direction. I think one other piece just to underscore is perhaps the efficiency piece, but that doesn't get talked about as much. We talk about new power, more power, different power, but frankly, being more efficient with what you've already got goes a long way. And economically, you actually get a bigger bang for your buck in that case in many instances. So we try to weave that, or certainly look at that in every program we do. We had a big piece in Ghana, actually, in that regard.
Can I add a quick...
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And before we jump in, I want to just note, it is noon. Let's go over like 5 or 10 minutes if people are comfortable with that. And if people need to leave, feel free, we understand. Go ahead.
So I thought you were heading towards the energy poverty conversation, which you were alluding to in part, but, you know, referencing the broader development demands. I think that's often presented as it's a false dichotomy in our view. Like take Power Africa, for example, that was launched under Obama with a primary goal of reducing energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, given the falling prices that you just mentioned for renewable energy and battery storage, renewable energy is the cheaper alternative in 2/3 of the countries where we're operating, and there's significant demand that has, you know, increased for that energy. It's also important to note that the U.S. government has now issued new guidelines which prohibit government funding for coal-fired power plants and which substantially limit investment in fossil fuels to very narrow circumstances where there's a national security exemption or no viable alternative with a strong development imperative. So, you know, everybody's very much keeping that development in mind, but there isn't any reason why we couldn't leapfrog fossil fuel infrastructure.
Can I touch on just one thing that I didn't mention, just related to energy poverty, that I think is important? I'll be really brief, but you know, often you find that the focus is on cities, or the focus is not on the poorest of the poor. And so, how do you make those connections? How do you connect people to power grids, or how do you support, you know, off-grid systems is also front and center in terms of what we do, including looking at tariff structures and how you subsidize those kinds of connections, or how you subsidize tariffs for people that are otherwise unable to afford power.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, just maybe adding one thing. If you're looking at low-income countries, the fact that they are dependent on fossil fuels is almost irrelevant because they need to grow their energy consumption so much that basically you can sort of like forget about the legacy and just focus on new investments. And as you said, in that case, we often find that just renewables make more sense economically. We have a different challenge in middle-income countries that have massive fleets of coal, especially, and then what you need is to replace that energy. And so I think the lock-in is much stronger in higher middle-income countries. I think for low-income countries, in a way, they are in a better place because they don't have this legacy and can go directly to the cheapest solutions today.
Yeah, that is also a really good point. And I think being mindful of time, we're going to just take 2 more questions, but we'll be here for a few minutes after if people want to come up and speak with us. So, yes, sir.
Edward Hoyt with Chemonics. I want to just maybe extend a little bit on this conversation about the transition, the energy transition, and ask about the role of political economy analyses and understanding the local political economies as shaping really the extent to which you can scale the utilization of renewables. What we see over and over again is that there is some space, but sooner or later, the incumbent utility, the incumbent players in a given market will lobby, will maneuver to impede further expansion. Mm-hmm. And one of the key things that we see in Glasgow, the announcement of the deal with South Africa about facilitating the transition away from coal raises the question of how, to what extent is there a need to invest in ways that will take those incumbent players out?
So what I'm hearing is filling the gap and scaling up for renewable energy.
Just to respond really briefly to that, I mean, I think, the political economy analysis, spot on, and this is something that I think I'll say we've been a little slow to catch on to, but we've been doing it now and need to really put that front and center in terms of when we get into a sector, what are the forces at play? What is it we're trying to do, and how are we going to make that succeed? Utilities, regulators, you have political changes and this is one of the dynamics we struggle with, because we'll start moving forward and then there'll be an election and things will shift. And so, in our aside from doing the analysis, we want to be mindful of that in terms of how we structure the program. That's where aligning and working with other donors and other organizations can really help. And frankly, it's also where our ability to go in at a government level, have the dialogue with the government, and then have big grant dollars and infrastructure to kind of leverage or incentivize those kinds of changes, because they have to be made, can actually be very effective.
Anyone else? Okay. Let's go. I'm really sorry. I'm just worried about time. We're going to have one more question. I really hate to ratchet this down, but...
Rosemary Garcia from Cardno International Development. It's really great to hear about adaptation and about scaling, and yet I have not heard anything about circular economy, both on the policy front, either domestically, internationally, on the development realm. So I wanted to get kind of a sense of where we are in that dialogue.
Well, that's a great question. The 3 R's are always part of what we talk about. So recycle, reuse, and reduce. So, and that's particularly important in our ocean world that I work in so much. So I don't know if anyone wants to address that at all.
Well, maybe very briefly, I think that's a double question to us and we're working on the topic. There's one question, which is how much of a more circular economy helps reduce energy consumption and therefore helps reduce emissions, keeping in mind that it's not always that obvious. Some of the recycling processes are very energy intensive, so it's something that needs to be explored basically product per product. There is another dimension which is really important, is if you look at the material needs for the green transition, for things like solar panels, batteries, and so on, the extraction that we need will be massive. And of course, if we're able to make that in a circular way, we will reduce a lot the demands. And considering the environmental consequences of extraction and the social and labor aspects, because I mean, extraction is not always the best sector in terms of labor conditions. There are a lot of benefits to have in something that's more circular. So we're really looking and exploring those two different issues. And we're also always trying to use the climate change momentum to talk about other environmental issues, because that's not the only environmental challenges we have in front of us, unfortunately.
Gillian, yes?
Just briefly on that, circular economy is definitely a passion of mine and an area of more and more conversation within USAID. I'm actually trying to get my hands on a bill that's being introduced in Germany right now that would relate to battery recycling. Further to your point about the 21 rare earths that we need to be mining and all of the associated environmental and human rights abuse. But, it goes beyond reduce, reusing, and recycling and towards some of the social and cultural issues we were talking about before, where we place such primacy on growth and acquisition and material wealth as a culture, and where, people look to the West and aspire to be, like that. So I think there's a lot of shifts that need to be made in terms of how we live our lives on this planet that are not going to be attended to with those three simple principles.
Yeah, I was on a call with Kiribati where we're doing a Corby right now, and that was certainly highlighted for the people there. So I hate to close this down. We've had such a robust discussion, and instead of the 3 R's, I'm going to talk about the 3 A's. We have heard a lot about ambition, action, and alliance, and I think those are really a great way to end today. And let's just give our panel a huge round of applause.
Thank you.
So thank you.